The jungle breathed around him, thick and wet, the same way it had for 28 years. Hiroo Onoda crouched behind a fallen log on Lubang Island, Philippines, his rifle, still meticulously maintained, resting across his knees. The metal was warm from the tropical sun filtering through the canopy. He was 52 years old, but in his mind he was still 23, still a second lieutenant in the Imperial Japanese Army, still at war. August 15, 1945 had come and gone. The Emperor's voice had crackled over radios across Japan, announcing surrender. Atomic fires had consumed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Millions had laid down their arms. But Hiroo Onoda never heard that broadcast. And even when he did hear whispers of peace, even when he found the leaflets dropped from planes declaring the war over, even when he saw newspapers left deliberately in his path, he did not believe. Because his commanding officer had told him never to surrender. Because a soldier's duty transcended reason, transcended evidence, transcended even reality itself. In the architecture of Onoda's mind, loyalty had become the load-bearing wall. Remove it, and everything collapsed. He wasn't alone in this personal war, not at first. 3 other soldiers had fled into the Lubang jungle with him in 1945, Yuichi Akatsu, Shoichi Shimada, and Kinshichi Kozuka. They built a world together in that green hell, a world where the war never ended, where every Filipino farmer was a potential enemy combatant, where survival and duty fused into something almost religious. They raided villages for rice and supplies. They evaded search parties. They killed, because in war, that's what soldiers do. Akatsu surrendered in 1950, finally broken by hunger and isolation. Onoda and the others concluded he was weak, that he'd succumbed to enemy propaganda. They fought on. Shimada died in a firefight with police in 1954. Then it was just Onoda and Kozuka, 2 men sustaining an entire war between them, 2 minds locked in a reality that had ceased to exist everywhere else on Earth. The thing about belief is that it doesn't require truth, it only requires conviction. And Onoda's conviction was forged in the fires of Nakano School, where he'd been trained in guerrilla warfare and intelligence operations, where they'd taught him that deception was the enemy's greatest weapon, that he must never trust what appears obvious. Every leaflet announcing peace? Obvious enemy propaganda. Every search party calling his name, urging surrender? Clearly a trap. The mind, once it commits to a narrative, will perform extraordinary gymnastics to maintain it. Kozuka fell to police billets in 1972 during a rice raid, leaving Onoda truly alone. 27 years into a war that had ended before most of the people hunting him were born. You might think that would break him. You would be wrong. Solitude only refined his purpose, distilled it to pure, uncut dedication. He was the last guardian of a truth everyone else had abandoned. He was faithful when the faithless had given up. But even the most fortified mind has cracks, and into one of those cracks walked Norio Suzuki, a 24-year-old Japanese adventurer who decided to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman in that order. In February 1974, this cheerful hippie stumbled into Onoda's camp, unarmed, friendly, speaking Japanese without the Filipino accent. He didn't try to convince Onoda the war was over. He simply talked, listened, connected. Onoda told him the only person who could order him to stand down was his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. That man, Onoda believed, was long dead. But Suzuki took that impossible demand seriously. He went back to Japan. He found Taniguchi alive, well, working as a bookseller, and somehow, miraculously, he convinced this elderly man to return to Lubang Island. Picture this moment. March 9, 1974. A small clearing in the jungle. Hiroo Onoda stands at attention in a uniform he's kept pristine for 29 years. Before him stands Major Taniguchi, now 60 years old, grayed and civilian, but wearing his old uniform one final time. The Major reads Special Order 2079, formally relieving 2nd Lieutenant Onoda of duty. Onoda salutes. hands over his rifle, his sword, his ammunition, and his hand grenades still operational, and his dignity, preserved like a relic from another age. The war for Hiroo Onoda was finally over. He had outlasted empires. He had sustained a reality through sheer force of will. He had been faithful beyond reason, beyond sanity, perhaps beyond humanity itself. But here's what haunts. Onoda wasn't unique. On Guam, Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi hid until 1972, discovered by hunters crying, "It is with much embarrassment that I return," because he felt shame at outliving his emperor's war. On Anatanan Island, Captain Sakae Oba held out till 1951 with 46 soldiers and civilians, creating a miniature empire of discipline and delusion. On Morotai Island, Teruo Nakamura, an indigenous Taiwanese conscript into the Japanese army, remained until 1974, the last of them all, fighting a war for a country he'd never chosen, speaking a language of loyalty he'd been forced to learn. Each man carved his own prison from belief. Each became a monument to what happens when duty detaches from purpose, when loyalty transcends the thing being served, when the war inside persists long after the war outside has ended. Onoda returned to Japan a celebration, but he couldn't recognize the country he'd fought for. The emperor was no longer divine, the military was neutered, the values he'd preserved had been abandoned by those he'd tried to protect. Eventually, he moved to Brazil, became a cattle rancher, returned occasionally to teach survival skills to young Japanese. He died in 2014 at 91, having lived more years after his war than during it. The question that lingers isn't why these men stayed, it's what war they were really fighting. Because the Americans had gone home, the Japanese had rebuilt, the Philippines had moved on. But inside the skulls of these holdouts, a different war raged, one where meaning came from mission, where identity merged with duty, where ending the fight meant annihilating the self. We remember them as curiosities, aberrations, men who couldn't accept reality. But walk through any city and you'll find them everywhere. People whose wars never ended, who clutch beliefs that serve them no purpose except to give structure to chaos, who would rather be faithful to a beautiful lie than face an ugly truth. The battlefield changes. The jungle might be ideology, might be addiction, might be a relationship that died years ago, but we keep resuscitating. The mechanism is identical. Hiroo Onoda maintained his rifle for 29 years in perfect working order. He could have stopped at any moment. The prison door was never locked, but he was convinced that stepping through it meant betraying everything he was, everything he'd suffered for, everyone he'd lost. So he stayed, dutiful, dedicated, destroyed by the very loyalty that defined him. The war had ended, but the warrior remained, trapped not by the enemy, but by the immaculate, terrible perfection of his own commitment. And sometimes, late at night, when the world feels incomprehensible and the old certainties feel safer than new truths, we're all holdouts in our own Lubang jungles, waiting for permission we'll never give ourselves to finally lay down arms and come home.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.